Have you ever wondered if a scar on your body started to ache, not from an injury, but because a spirit was getting close? Have you ever met someone on the street you thought was homeless, but their eyes looked like they had lived for centuries? And if one day someone told you, "I will bear the debt for you," would you believe them? Welcome back to the Whisper Horror channel, where we unveil forgotten shadows together. If you love spiritual horror stories with no jump scares, just lingering dread, please hit the like button, subscribe, and turn on notifications, because every week, Gabriel will tell you a story that has never been told. Today we are entering the first episode of our long-running series, Gabriel, the Debt Walker. It is a quiet but deeply scarred journey, where a man who bears the debts of souls is slowly decaying because he cannot die, and the story begins on a cold street corner in New Jersey, where a pain is about to awaken an old demon. The night rain sliced through the streets like thin knives, piercing the thick, cold, and somber air of suburban New Jersey. Under the faint yellow streetlight, Gabriel huddled closer to a moss-covered wall, the dampness seeping deep into his bones. His old, wrinkled cloak stained with rain, silently molded over his thin shoulders. Gabriel's bare, emaciated hands trembled as they rose with a slight convulsion from the cold and a pain he was all too familiar with. The wind swept by, whipping the rain into lashes that struck his body in waves. Hidden beneath the fabric, his old scars, once healthy skin, were now just ridged, lumpy strips of flesh against a pale backdrop. Some were dark purple bruises like old mud, while others still oozed a pale red, as if they had never healed. As the rain lashed down, each scar stung like salt. The cold water streamed over them, causing the deepest wounds to weep blood, mixing with the water to form faint pink streaks on his neck and the back of his cloak. Gabriel squeezed his eyes shut, trying to control his breathing, but the pain surged like an undercurrent, and every small gust of wind made each muscle ache even more. In that moment, he felt like he wasn't a man of flesh and blood, but a collection of horrific marks left by time, hatred, and the anguish of souls. Flickering memories appeared behind his throbbing eyelids. Fire, screaming, and a burnt hand reaching toward him in vain. Guilt and obsession pressed down on his body, forming scars that dug deep into his consciousness every endless night. He raised a finger and slowly traced the deep gash on his left shoulder. It was where the first soul he owed a debt to had resided, the place where Gabriel first understood the pain of a restless spirit. Every slight tremor from the wound, every slow seep of blood, reminded him that this debt had never been freed. The rain kept falling, with no sign of stopping, just like the gnawing torment and dull pain inside Gabriel that had left him no peace for so many years. Gabriel huddled his body again, trying to shield his scars with his cloak, knowing full well that tonight's pain had only just begun. Deep down he felt that every wound on his body was also a gateway for resentful spirits, for lost souls to return in this cold, dark night. The air around Gabriel was murky and thick, like a fog that refused to dissipate. At night, the suburban streets were nothing but cold vapor rising from the ground, streaked with the light of street lamps. The old streetlights flickered, their broken light casting across the derelict roofs, creating chaotic patches of light and shadow that crawled over the crumbling pavement. The wind swept across, carrying the smell of damp, rotting earth, decay, and the stale odor of garbage that had been forgotten for days. Sometimes, a very faint sound echoed on the wind, like the footsteps of someone swallowed by the rain, or perhaps just a hallucination from the ancient echoes of this haunted city. Gabriel remained motionless, feeling every cold breath seep into his lungs, bringing with it a heavy sensation, as if something invisible was slowly spreading through his flesh. He looked down the street, where the darkness was increasingly suffocating everything. At the edge of his vision, the twisted old trees cast winding black shadows on the cement walls, exactly like hands quietly groping for something in the rain. The darkness didn't just surround him, it seemed to coil around him. Gabriel felt it snake into the creases of his cloak, burrowing deep between the scars on his skin. It was a thick darkness mingled with a suffocating loneliness. With every gust of wind, he heard whispers mixed in with the rain. Sometimes it sounded like a conversation, other times it was just the breath of nameless, faceless, wandering souls. The entire space seemed to press down, squeezing Gabriel, making it hard for him to distinguish his own whispered fears from the faint signals of an impending supernatural disaster. The pouring rain grew heavier, as if to wash away his small body on the cold ground. At times, in the flickering light reflected on a puddle, Gabriel imagined the shape of someone or something standing across the street, motionless, lost in the thick black rain. He shivered. In this place, everything was suffocating, every shape blurred by water and darkness. Every sound seemed to sink, distort and stretch unnaturally, as if some force was drilling deep into all of Gabriel's senses, constantly reminding him that his existence in this moment was just a blurred smudge in a vast, harsh and endless ocean of darkness. The initial pain was just a throbbing that spread through his body. Then it quickly submerged Gabriel's consciousness in a thick fog of confusion and obsession. Under the sky, thick with rain and darkness, Gabriel drifted off, or more accurately, was pulled down into the depths of a fractured dream. Flickering around him were fragmented images. The blurry yellow light of ceremonial candles, the icy chill of a grey stone room where everything began to slip out of control. The sound of prayer echoed, dry and cracked, falling onto the tile floor like broken gravel. There, Gabriel saw his own form flickering among broken salt circles, facing dark corners that oozed with resentment. It was impossible to distinguish the living from the writhing filth of souls. Strange faces appeared one after another in the darkness. Their gazes were fierce, piercing every barrier of reason. Some eyes were filled with pure horror, others were full of hatred. Some looked like they wanted to kill him with just a direct stare from the realm of the dead. Screams, sobs, and the voice calling Gabriel's name stretched into his bones, then blended with the sound of the rain. All of it gripped his mind tightly. He struggled to get out of the memory, but the more he struggled, the black shadow in the dream coiled tighter. In that trance, Gabriel felt he was drifting between the gloomy boundary of his personal memories and the remnants of pain from every soul he had ever taken on a debt for. The cold wind felt like it was piercing his eardrums, bringing with it the chill of failure, of helplessness against an unstoppable supernatural force. That feeling wasn't just simple fear, it was a violent tearing between his strong will to help and the confusion and doubt about his own human limitations. Could a soul, a mortal tormented by countless debts like Gabriel, still manage to get up and continue? Or would he be forever submerged in the sea of broken memories and cold despair? When he jolted awake, a trembling sensation still ran down his spine. His throat was dry, and his hands were still clenched tight, as if clinging to the last thread between reality and a dream. The night's rain hadn't stopped. The terrifying trance had only just ended, but its aftermath had worn away a bit more of the fragile hope that remained in Gabriel. Under the flickering light of the pale yellow streetlights, Gabriel walked heavily on the damp, broken bricks of a deserted and narrow street. Each of his steps seemed to drag a heavy piece of his sadness, of old wounds in his heart that had never healed. The rain grew heavier with each moment. The raindrops streamed down his grey face, washing away the dust from the road, but they could not soothe the cold that clung to every layer of the wandering man's calloused skin. Gabriel quietly blended into the hurried crowd, where people passed through each other's lives with rushed movements and emotionless stares. Not a single one of them stopped long enough to see his face clearly, and no one paid any attention to the soft plea from the desperate man at the end of the street. The feeling of being invisible, pushed out of the world of the living, tormented Gabriel like a cold and silent punishment. At times, he could only bow his head, his trembling hand extended toward the fleeting figures. It was a fragile attempt to cling to the last bit of human warmth that remained. Occasionally, an old pair of eyes would pass him in the cold wind, showing a brief moment of pity before looking down, avoiding him, as if afraid his misfortune could be spread with a glance. Sometimes Gabriel received a hastily tossed piece of bread, or even cold sneers and clicks of the tongue from strangers afraid to stop and face their own potential misery. The sound of the rain blended with the soft whispers, creating a lonely chorus on the edge of life. Beneath that rain, every gesture of begging from Gabriel was both desperate and endlessly patient. Not because he expected pity, but because these were the last small fragments of humanity and compassion that remained among the world's layers of forgetting. Gabriel knew he was an outsider, a soul burdened with an invisible sentence, but he still quietly preserved his will to live, cherishing every fragile glimmer of human kindness. Because in this life, as long as there is one small spark of light, it can sometimes be enough to temporarily soothe a long, desperately cold night. Gabriel sat leaning against the damp wall, his slow breath blending with the sound of the rain still pattering on the cold tin roof. In the silent darkness, with only wind and water, a cold shiver suddenly ran down his spine, making his whole body shudder. He gently turned his shoulder, his trembling hand touching the spot on his cloak that was both wet with rain and unusually moist. As his dry, thin fingers touched his back, he was horrified to find that an old scar, where the skin had been dry and calloused for years, was suddenly weeping cold drops of blood. The dark red blood soaked into the thin cloak, mixing with the falling rain to form small, strange, mottled streaks on the rough bricks, creating a remarkably bizarre mark in the night. That scar was no longer just a memory of the past. It had become a sacred omen, sending a faint message from the invisible realm. The seeping blood was like a silent alarm from the world of spirits. Gabriel was being watched, and this entity was not just a passing shadow. It was a dark, vengeful spirit with a power and hatred that was growing stronger nearby. A sharp pain spread across his shoulder, neck, into every vertebra, making him hold his breath. His face went pale, and his entire body tensed, bracing for the coming storm. Cold and pain intertwined, seeping into every nerve ending. All of his senses were on high alert, straining toward the ominous source of danger. With his experience and strange intuition, Gabriel knew this was an unavoidable sign, a new brutal challenge about to be placed on his shoulders. That warning wasn't just physical, it was carved deep into his soul. It would pull him into a vortex of darkness, and the karma from the unreleased world would drown him if he faltered for even a single breath. Amidst the cold wind lashing down with every sheet of rain, Gabriel was startled to hear a strange sound, faintly punctuating the space where only the running water and his own heavy footsteps had been. It was a whisper, floating up from the back of his neck, vaguely pinning itself deep into his spine. The voice had no form or clear face. It was as cold as water flowing backward, and it wavered as if coming from another realm. It was both familiar and strange, both desolate and full of hatred. The tone blended with the rain. Sometimes it was a whisper right next to his ear. Other times it seemed to come from under his feet, a dull, bone-chilling sound. Each whisper made Gabriel's heart jump, and his chest tightened, feeling like a rope was constricting his neck and mind. He tried to stay calm, exhaling a cold mist from his dry lips, but he couldn't hide the rising panic in his heart. His body was rigid, all his senses hypnotized by the eerie rhythm of the gloomy night. He whipped his head around, but all he saw was a thick black darkness. Behind his back was a dense curtain of rain, covering all signs of life. The entire space became heavy and silent, so much so that Gabriel could clearly hear the frantic beat of his own heart. At that moment, the world was nothing but the drawn-out, dripping sound of whispers, coiling around his mind, hinting at a presence beyond his rational control. Gradually, Gabriel understood that his mind was facing an invisible force, one that wasn't just here to scare him, but to test him, to push him to the very edge of physical and spiritual exhaustion. That whisper was a sign of a new battle, a warning from the other side of life, that the most painful trials were still ahead. The ghosts had never truly left him, just waiting for the right moment to overwhelm the body and soul of this tormented man on his path to atonement. The late night descended, full of heavy gray clouds, and a cold wind surrounded the abandoned industrial area, where time seemed to have stopped many years ago. Moss-covered cement walls, rotting signs hanging loosely, and puddles of water on the cracked brick ground reflected the faint yellow streetlights into weak, flickering patches of light, as if cursing the presence of anyone wandering around at this hour. Kenji walked quietly, his thin coat clinging to his body, the caked-on dirt a reminder of a life that had never been peaceful. The old backpack hung heavy on his thin shoulders, and each step was a tiny sigh in the endless, lingering night rain. He had just finished his shift at the convenience store, exhausted and with his mind as tense as a wire. He longed for nothing more than a peaceful sleep in his miserable room at the end of the alley. The surrounding area was thick with dampness. The scattered sounds of insects had mostly given in to the night's cold, and only the relentless rain could be heard tapping on the old tin roof. The air was already thick with loneliness, but tonight something felt very strange. Kenji suddenly realized that with every one of his steps there was a gust of wind following him, a sound of footsteps trailing behind, silent and persistent. He quickened his pace, then stopped abruptly. Looking back, there was only the dark, watery street and his own stretched, distorted shadow. The streetlight flickered, giving the impression that another shadow was blending in behind him, but the whole street was still just Kenji, and the unease in the cold rain suddenly grew stronger. His heart pounded frantically, and each breath became more difficult. When Kenji started walking again, the feeling of being watched didn't fade away. It became heavy, like a dark shadow clinging to him from the back of his neck all the way down his spine. The sound of the rain, the wind, the lights, everything seemed to blend into a single, suffocating chorus, warning him that tonight would not be like any other night. Kenji's footsteps echoed steadily on the empty road, but mixed with them was a slow, heavy pace that followed his every move. Every time he stopped, the space seemed to thicken, and then, the footsteps behind him also fell silent. When he continued walking, that sound echoed again, like a ghostly refrain repeating in his subconscious. The streetlight flickered unnaturally, its weak light just enough to draw winding black streaks that slithered along the walls and pavement, like countless invisible hands groping around Kenji. In the watery puddles, his reflection was distorted and warped. It wasn't him anymore, but a strange figure clinging to his every breath. The unease built up into an obsession, right in his young chest. All of Kenji's senses were on high alert, in extreme tension as the footsteps repeated, sometimes fast, sometimes slow, as if deliberately creating a rhythm to follow and test his will. When Kenji trembled and walked faster, the other sound also quickened. When he paused, the darkness covered his back even more completely. That strange presence surrounded him, coiling tightly around Kenji in the thick icy night. He didn't dare to look back. He just felt like he was being held captive within layers of cold air and nameless secrets. The more he tried to deny it, the more the fear in his heart spread, pulling him deeper into a nightmare in broad daylight. A place where reason was just a fragile fortress against an existence that could not be seen or grasped, yet was present right next to him with every breath of his lonely youth. Kenji hurried through the bone-chilling darkness, each step feeling glued to the street by something invisible clinging to the back of his neck. Panic made him rush through a narrow turn, hoping to temporarily escape the persistent feeling of being watched. The alley was pitch black. The sound of wind blowing through broken windows and moss-covered walls was eerily silent. He strayed from the old path, hoping the shadow behind him would lose its way. But when he looked up at the watery street, a chill ran down Kenji's spine. His reflection at his feet hadn't changed. It was still his silhouette, but blurred and distorted, as if glued to the folds of his cloak behind him. The shadow was no longer just a distortion of light. It was like a separate, living entity, moving in sync with his every breath. His heart clenched, and a feeling of despair and helplessness surged in his chest. Whether he ran or changed direction, Kenji could not escape the siege of the darkness and that invisible figure. He realized the shadow behind him was no longer just a physical thing. It was a true haunting, existing with his soul, trapping him deeper inside the desperate box of fear. In that bone-chilling silence, Kenji was like a lost man in a maze with no way out. Every turn led back to the same figure calling from the depths of his own being. The night rain poured down on the abandoned neighborhood, mixing with the rustling wind and the cold that pierced Kenji's thin coat like needles. His footsteps gradually slowed. His confusion and disorientation grew as a strange sound suddenly echoed in the space. The clear, fragmented and cold laughter of a woman coming from behind him. That sound was not just normal laughter. It was sharp and pointed, yet also soft like mist. It seeped through every crevice in the rain, echoing faintly before suddenly rushing to the back of Kenji's neck, making him shiver. Sometimes it sounded so close it was almost hissing in his ear. Other times it was distant, as if echoing from beyond the ruined roof. The thought of turning around flashed in his mind, but he couldn't. In his mind, Kenji seemed to catch a glimpse of a young woman's figure. Her long wet hair was matted over her face, and her eyes held nothing but an emptiness floating in the endless rain. The feeling of that figure drifted with each burst of laughter, becoming calmer but clinging to him, pouring fear onto the young student's weak footsteps. The heavy rain beat on the broken glass, and the sparse streetlights shone on the muddy puddles. Kenji kanagling di kanagling yu, lunso vayo kamgag mayman. Mubyo gumbo tugirde, kankon la turnyang senshakne, madabinsano dautrong netam. A place where his secret fears erupted into haunting monsters. The woman's laughter became a ghostly melody, waking up all of his young memories, pulling Kenji's neck down into the mire of despair and confusion. Every muscle, every thought in Kenji was bound by that laughter, a layered echoing sound that followed him the entire way home, marking the beginning of a tense and painful spiritual battle where the line between everyday life and the supernatural world was completely erased. The confusion pulled Kenji into a violent vortex of conflict between his reason and the supernatural darkness. The consecutive work days, the bouts of insomnia, financial pressure and mounting schoolwork made him start to question himself. Were all these hauntings just a product of his exhausted mind, or were they a real sign from another world? One night while walking home late, Kenji decided to use his phone to record behind him, to try to prove to himself that there was nothing there but shadows and rain. But when he watched the video, his heart felt like it was being squeezed. A faint hazy figure, not clearly defined, appeared right behind him, blending into the rain as if it had just stepped out of the boundary between reality and illusion. The twisting contradiction between the sharp conviction of his reason and the strange image on his phone sent Kenji into a state of turmoil. Disintegrating between two layers of reality, he no longer knew what truth to hold on to. His fear grew, tightening around his throat and trapping his mind in a state of chaos he couldn't escape. He stood silently in the crowd. The lights flickered, the rain fell sparsely, and he felt helpless, as if stuck in a liminal space where every familiar truth suddenly melted into mottled patches of unease.
The darkness, the digital camera, and the self-doubt all turned Kenji into a lost soul. He was no longer certain of anything, not even his own existence. The terrifying vibrations of being constantly haunted by a ghost drove Kenji to seek empathy from others. He told his roommate, his colleagues, and anyone who was willing to listen, a story about a ghost and the footsteps that followed him every night. He hoped for a word of comfort, a scientific explanation, or at the very least a sympathetic look. But all he got in return were sneers, wary glances, or comments telling him he was probably going crazy from too much stress. Some told Kenji he should take some time off work. Others suggested he was just imagining things due to loneliness, lack of sleep, and self-suggestion. No one believed his supernatural story. The more he spoke, the more he felt pushed to the edge of all shared concern, as if he was pushing himself into a bottomless pit of loneliness. The more he struggled, the deeper he sank. Standing in the middle of a crowd in the city that never sleeps, Kenji felt a heartbreaking sense of being lost and fragile. People could be physically close, but their spirits were as cold as empty rooms. There was no sharing, no companionship. No one was patient enough to listen to the fears of a young man who was breaking apart. The cracks spread within him. His spirit wavered more and more, making every night's walk home feel heavier with despair. And then, in the middle of that rainy night, when all hope of connecting with reality vanished, the invisible ghost seemed to tighten its grip, like a cold yoke gnawing at his last bit of life force. It pushed Kenji deep into a dark place of loneliness, where there was only fear, the ghost, and the sound of footsteps echoing endlessly behind him.
Kenji sighed as he dragged his heavy feet across the abandoned bus depot. The faint yellow light mottled the decaying ground, piercing through the thin, thick layer of mist hanging in the cold night. The wind rushed through the cracks in the rusty walls, sweeping gently over the broken awning, carrying with it a rustling sound that seemed like the resentful breath of a dead city. The sound of fine rain pattered on the shattered glass, adding to the symphony of loneliness that surrounded every corner of Kenji's soul. Suddenly, in a dark corner next to a wall, a figure quietly huddled, appearing under the blurry light of the streetlight. It was a man who radiated an air of extreme weariness. His faded cloak was soaked with rain and mist, stained with streaks of black dirt, weighing heavily like the past upon his gaunt body. Dozens of rough, large and small scars were etched all over his hands, face, neck and shoulders. They were marks of age and of pain that tore his flesh, reminding him of the long-suffering path he had endured. Gabriel lay motionless, his face turned toward the sidewalk, his eyes tightly shut as if trying to sleep, or to find a dream that would let him forget his life for a while. His face was both tough and fragile, belonging to a man who had gone past the other side of suffering, where only the heavy will to endure remained in every exhausted and hardened feature. His entire body was a living portrait of pain. Each scar was a story that could never be fully told. Every breath was a part of the mystical debt that someone had left for him to bear. Witnessing that sight, Kenji stood frozen, an indescribable feeling of pity and obsession rising within him. He couldn't help but be curious about this lonely man. Why did he choose to lie in the cold world like a sad statue? Even more than that, Gabriel's image in the rainy night was so intensely real that it felt suffocating. It was like both a prophecy of another world and a reflection of Kenji himself, a young soul being pulled by darkness into a chasm of fear and loneliness. The cold from the rain made the moment of their encounter even more vivid. It was as if this meeting wasn't a coincidence, but that their shared pain and heavy burdens had guided them to find each other on the edge of life. Kenji quietly bent down, his hands trembling as he rummaged through his old backpack. A feeling of compassion and an inexplicable urge prompted him to take out a slightly stale loaf of bread and the only can of water he had left after his night shift. Without a word, Kenji knelt gently, offering both items to the man huddled by the damp wall. Around them was still a thick layer of fog, the cold biting into their skin. The rain tapped incessantly on the peeling awning. In that bleak setting, Kenji's small, unexpected gesture flashed like a warm streak of light across the night. It was a rare, silent moment that poured a very human feeling into the freezing air. Gabriel opened his eyes. His initial look was a bit stunned. Then it slowly changed into a gaze that was both grateful and filled with anguish. His eyes were deep, simmering with the cold of nameless losses, but now they held an unexpected touch of emotion from the young man's anonymous kindness. That look seemed to recognize the tiny crack in Kenji's heart, an instinct of empathy that needed no words. They just looked at each other in awkward silence. There were no loud thank yous, no awkwardness. Amidst the flying rain and howling wind, where time seemed to freeze, two outcasts from two ends of the world suddenly found a moment of connection. It was like a silent promise that only the most desperate could understand. If there is still one act of kindness, even in the coldest darkness, a small flame of human hope can ignite. Gabriel smiled faintly, a gentle smile mixed with a haunting mystery that echoed in the cold space of the dilapidated bus depot. The thanks he offered wasn't just simple courtesy. It was a resonant sound full of hidden meaning, as if he had carved Kenji's name into his world a long time ago, from a place that went beyond both space and time. You know, Kenji, I have been waiting for this moment for a very long time. Your arrival is no coincidence, Gabriel said in a deep voice. Each word seemed to soak into Kenji's flesh, stirring his blood and deep hidden memories that he himself had never named. Kenji froze. His heart pounded, and his throat was dry amid the rush of confusion and surprise. The certainty in Gabriel's voice, along with the way he said Kenji's name correctly despite never being introduced, turned Kenji's reality upside down. Suddenly, in that instant, all sense of reality around him seemed to recede, giving way to another layer of emotion. A place where the line between the mundane and the supernatural was erased, leaving only one big question about the origin of destiny. Those words, brimming with secrets, didn't just spark extreme curiosity. They were like a key opening a door to the world of spirits, of ancient connections, and an unknown challenge ahead. It was the moment when two separate individuals began to feel they belonged to a shared current of destiny, a place where the past, present, and future intertwined, hanging over the journey behind every scar, every shadow, and the hope that was about to burn brightly. Gabriel stopped, standing opposite Kenji amid the thick rain and mist, and the blurry yellow lights, creating a particularly cold and tense moment. Gabriel's gaze, his deep eyes always shrouded in weariness, seemed to constantly probe the depths of Kenji's soul, as if wanting to read every secret, fear, and everything that Kenji himself had been avoiding. "Tell me, is it still following you?" Gabriel said in a low, deep voice that settled like a cold gust of wind spreading through the space. That wasn't a normal question. It was a validation, a confirmation of the persistent presence that had never left Kenji's back. That ghost, that fear, that obsession that parasitically lived off his youth. In that moment, time seemed to be compressed. Kenji suddenly realized that Gabriel wasn't just a stranger. He seemed to be both an admirer and a first-hand witness to the invisible wound he had always tried to hide. That question echoed as an undeniable acknowledgement, forcing Kenji to truly confront the haunting he carried for the very first time. The secret connection and the weight of that conversational bridge didn't make Kenji retreat in fear. Instead, it made him feel as if his loneliness and fear, which had been drowning him day and night, were being shared, even if just for a few seconds. Between them, an invisible boundary was established, and then erased, pulling Kenji deeper into a mysterious journey of darkness and spiritual challenges that both he and Gabriel had to face in silence and empathy. Kenji slowly turned his head, just as a cold gust of wind rushed through, sweeping away the solitary rotting leaves by the roadside. In that moment, the space around him seemed to awaken with a vague rhythm of movement. The darkness that covered the ground, the street corners, and the old fences suddenly quivered and shook as if breathing, as if a mysterious entity was revealing its life at that very moment. Only Kenji felt that ripple. It was something no one but him could perceive, like an invisible call, a subtle reminder from the spirit world echoing through the rain-soaked air. Nothing was visible, but Kenji's heart and every cell in his body understood. Something was present beside him, infiltrating every physical boundary and silently casting a nameless shadow over his life. The wind hissed again, carrying the old scent of earth, rain, and loneliness. The darkness, which was normally a silent backdrop, had now become a subject with a rhythm. It knew how to vibrate. It knew how to watch Kenji's every action and thought. Facing that reality, which was both real and surreal, he felt an instinctive fear well up inside, but at the same time he was driven by an instinctual curiosity. Where was the other world trying to lead him, and why did that darkness only leave traces for him alone to feel? In that moment, all of Kenji's senses seemed to be amplified to the extreme. The air was compressed and icy cold, and an invisible pressure coiled tightly around his mind, pulling the reader deep into an endless vortex of ghostly emotions. It was a place where darkness and light, the tangible and the invisible, intersected, and everything that had not, would not, and was happening was just a turn of the head away. After the long, drawn-out moment of quiet, amidst the rain and the blowing wind, Gabriel slowly turned to Kenji. His gaze was now gentle yet profound, as if it could see through many layers of memory and hidden secrets. He said in a deep voice, "I want to stay here for a few days. to check your way home, to follow the footprints that have been imprinted on the ground that you have never noticed. That statement wasn't just a simple request for shelter. It rang out like a call of destiny, suggesting a journey to explore the past and confront the ghosts waiting to be released. The hidden meaning in each word, check your way home, footprints on the ground, was a metaphor for finding the origin of the darkness, explaining the soul's missteps, and re-establishing the boundary between the living and the deceased. Kenji hesitated. There were conflicts within him. One part was wary and hesitant about the mysterious man's true intentions. The other part was driven by Gabriel's calm but powerful presence, the strange warmth he brought in the midst of a sea of isolation. He realized that all this time he had needed a support, even if it was just to be next to a stranger with many separate wounds and secrets. And that very thing, the silent thread of empathy, was like a new bloodline that seeped in and pierced through all his fears, making it hard for Kenji to refuse. The distance between the two of them slowly narrowed. They, once strangers on a lonely journey, were suddenly bound together by an invisible logic of destiny and memory. From this moment, their stories were no longer just a journey of running from the darkness. They had transformed into an active confrontation with the pains of the past and the hidden memories, opening a new chapter for forgiveness, for the human soul and the silent ghost at their feet. It was at this crossroads that Gabriel and Kenji stepped onto a new path. A journey to find the origin of the darkness, and to decipher the footprints that no longer belonged to just one person, but to two mortals bearing a debt, searching for peace and liberation for themselves and for the souls that had never been named. The old car turned into the gloomy suburban area. Its dim headlights cast the shadows of two small figures in the heavy rain. Gabriel and Kenji slowly got out. The cold, musty air from the ground seeped through the layers of their old cloaks. In front of them was a crooked monument, covered in moss and rotting flowers. It was a testament to a time when someone had stopped to remember, but was now no longer cared for by anyone. The weak moonlight touched the surface of the faded stone column. The inscriptions from long ago were now just cracks, blurred into a layer of moss and dirt that could not be washed away. The air around it was thick with the smell of decay. The silence was chilling, punctuated only by the light sound of rain hitting the dry branches, creating a fragmented rhythm of time. Gabriel stood quietly by the monument. His eyes read every worn scratch, his fingers gently stroking the cold stone surface, as if trying to retrace the forms of old souls. Kenji, on the other hand, stepped lightly on the thick layer of rotting leaves. Each step seemed to bring up fragments of memory, a dry rustling sound that echoed in the vast silence. A feeling of nostalgia mixed with anxiety rose in the hearts of both men. The wind blew through, carrying the echoes of a vague whisper, as if the forgotten past of this place was beginning to awaken, squeezing time and pulling all life closer to the edge of painful memories. That space was both somber and haunting, a land where every bit of moss and every stone buried a pain that had long gone unnamed, a shared wound of the past that was flooding back, demanding an answer. Among the withered yellow leaves covering the cold, damp grass next to the monument, Kenji accidentally discovered an old rusty tin box, almost submerged in a layer of rotting soil and weeds. He slowly pried it out, his palm covered in mud. When he opened the lid, both of them were stunned to see a bundle of torn papers inside. It was a section of a diary that had been carefully folded, but it was now soaked with water. The edges of each page were curled, the handwriting was smeared, and the ink lines had bled into each other like silent, desperate cries. Gabriel sat beside him, his eyes heavy with sadness, watching Kenji's every cautious movement as he opened each fragile page. The first lines, the handwriting was almost completely erased by rain and time, mottled like the memory of the victim, a girl named Eliza, who no longer had the strength to hold on to the memories of her life. Kenji scanned each fragmented line. I cried again tonight. I'm scared. I don't dare to tell anyone. Marcus went somewhere again, without saying anything. I guess I'm the only one who remembers this place. I'm hungry and cold, but I'm still waiting. If no one comes looking for me tomorrow, will anyone remember me? Each word, each trembling stroke of the pen, conveyed an ultimate loneliness and humiliation. The diary entries were disjointed. Some pages only had broken sentences, with incomplete thoughts, evidence of a weak mental struggle against adversity, and of being suffocated by painful emotions that were never spoken. Gabriel didn't take his eyes off the faded lines of ink. A deep sense of empathy rose in his heart. For him, all souls clinging to the mortal world also left behind pieces of an invisible, unfinished diary. The only difference was that Eliza was a soul in so much pain that every single letter radiated an unspeakable despair.
In the silence worn away by the lonely sound of rain, the diary fragment became a spiritual bridge, tearing open a door to a painful past. It was a place where the cracks in memory had never been soothed, where all the loneliness, resentment, and final wishes had turned into unspoken words. And that was the moment when Gabriel and Kenji were forced to step deeper into the sad story of Eliza's soul and the injustices that had never been solved. Every watery and trembling line in the diary gradually revealed the sunken story of a young girl named Eliza. Through the fragmented writings, Kenji and Gabriel slowly pieced together a portrait of Marcus, a name that appeared again and again like a deep gash on every page. Eliza wrote about the early days, full of hope, her hard work, and her simple dreams with the man she thought would be her first true support in life. However, as time went on, the handwriting became more broken and thick with suppressed anger. Marcus had changed. He was not only indifferent and heartless, but he also siphoned off the meager savings Eliza had painstakingly saved from her extra shifts and skipped meals. The feelings of being used, the cold conversations, "I need money again today. Can you pick up an extra shift? It's okay to come home late tomorrow. I have plans with friends." Every word repeated, as cruel as a rusty knife plunged through her fragile trust. Marcus appeared in Eliza's memory like a haunting ghost, not a supernatural one, but a bitter residue of betrayal and selfishness. It was the deception, the emotional and mental exhaustion that Marcus caused, that was the simmering fuse for the long-lasting tragedy that followed. A determined young soul, abandoned in pain, with no place left to cling to. In that somber atmosphere, both Gabriel and Kenji felt the conflict, the heartbreak, and the rising tragedy. Eliza had only yearned for a little human kindness, but all she received was exploitation and ultimate indifference. This was the key piece of the tragedy, the knot behind the looping injustice that pushed Eliza from being fragile and weak into a restless spirit. It set the stage for a chain of hauntings that would continue to plague so many lonely young people afterward. The city's night sky was torn apart by gray streaks of rain. The water poured down as if trying to erase all traces of the old world. Eliza, in the memories that recorded the last hours of her life, had left the miserable tavern, letting the drunkenness overwhelm her reason. Each of her steps on the empty sidewalk painted a staggering fragile silhouette, like a flickering candle in a cold wind. Her hair and clothes were blurred with both rain and tears to the point that no one could distinguish what was water and what was sorrow. The phone in Eliza's hand vibrated again and again as she called Marcus, a desperate call in the heart of the desolate city. But on the other end, there was only darkness, only silence, only the painful turning away of the entire world. The rain beat mercilessly on the tin roof, dropping down in individual drops like hammer blows, like the cold chime of a bell announcing the end of a lost life. In every soaked page of the diary, Eliza lamented her loneliness, her despair, and her dying hope. That night, with the drunkenness seeping into her blood and the pain soaking into her soul, was the fated moment when all her hatred awoke, transforming her sorrow into a resentful spirit, turning her weakness into intense vengeance. Eliza's ghostly power also began here, when her unsoothed soul chose the path of revenge, clinging to her pain and attaching it to lonely young men on rainy nights, creating the vicious loop that Gabriel and Kenji were now trying to break. Gabriel and Kenji quietly went deeper into the village, walking through small streets mottled with weak yellow light, where every breath seemed to be held in fear. They gently questioned the local residents, but the looks they received were only full of apprehension, secrecy, and hidden meanings. Only when they stood in dark corners, amidst the howling wind, were the whispered stories slowly revealed. Stories about young men who would often go home late at night and never return. The stories were fragmented. Some said, "Every night we hear strange sounds on the way to the old depot." Others said with caution, they were all young tenants. Nobody was close to them. In the morning, their cold bodies would be found in the empty streets. The common thread was that every incident was sudden, strange, with no warning signs, leaving behind only watery footprints and crushed grass on the ground, like despair being swept into the night. No one could explain the cause, and no one dared to comment loudly. Only mothers warned their sons, "Don't wander around at night. That place is cursed." Gabriel busied himself writing down every detail, the nuance of each look, and the unsettling whispers. He realized that the confusion and unease in each story didn't just come from isolated incidents. It was an accumulation over generations, rooted deep in the community's subconscious. As they got closer to the end, the atmosphere in the village became thick with fear. Pedestrians avoided eye contact, haunted by the feeling that something was always watching them from the darkness. The tragedy was no longer just Eliza's. It had become a bias waiting to pull everyone into the same vicious cycle. A sad song that flowed through generations, with each incident burning the curse deeper into the minds of those who survived. The entire reality had become like a staged play, where fear and an uncertain destiny controlled every activity. The tension and darkness lingered, suffocating them, signaling a great challenge ahead. The moment when both Gabriel and Kenji would have to decisively confront the source of all the hauntings, find the truth to save the soul, and attempt to break the deadly loop that was slowly tightening around the entire community. Under the heavy rain, Gabriel sat still by the moss-covered stone monument, gently closing his eyes to immerse himself in the synchronized rhythm of nature and unspoken sorrow. The sound of water dripping through the old awning, echoing from the bare trees in the distance, and the silent sigh of the earth and sky formed a symphony of regret and profound loneliness. Suddenly, like a flash of memory, a woman's figure appeared beside him. The soul's eyes were empty. There was no sign of life left, only the deep echoes of pain. She stood there, her dry thin hair tangled. Her shoulders trembled with her fractured, choked sobs in the rain, which blended with the long drawn-out sound of the wind through the trees and the deserted square. Gabriel was silent, letting the sadness soak into every breath. The soul did not notice his presence. It just wandered around in a daze, with no place to rest, trapped between the layers of light and darkness. It bridged the ultimate loneliness of unreleased souls. The silent and somber moment, mixed with the sound of the rain, created an unprecedented spiritual depth. Gabriel felt an invisible connection between himself and the sorrowful ghost, a heartbreaking communion, a complete empathy for Eliza's pain, helplessness, and her longing to be released. Hidden in that moment of meditation was a message of forgiveness, compassion, enlightenment, and the hope of salvation for the souls still lost in the land of suffering. This was not just a pause for thought before the climax, but a calming rhythm for Gabriel to mentally prepare to go to the very end of his path of atonement, a place where only empathy and a deep core understanding would be enough to sustain his steps and open up hope to break the cycle of karma for both the living and the dead.
Gabriel stepped into the center of the scene, the damp, cold, and mushy mossy ground beneath his every step. In his hand was a bag of pure white salt. Each grain held the solemnity and the idea of purification passed down through generations. Under the pale yellow lantern light, he slowly and precisely sprinkled handfuls of salt, drawing a sharp, protective circle around the area of the incident. It was a sacred boundary that absolutely would not allow the darkness to enter. Every one of Gabriel's fingers trembled, but not out of fear. It was from his clear awareness of the importance of this ritual. The faint light from the lantern reflected on the salt grains, making the barrier around the scene look like thin but firm surreal streaks of light, creating an invisible layer of spiritual energy. Gabriel mumbled an ancient incantation. The secret rhythm echoed in the dark night, blending with the pungent, clean smell of salt and the sweet taste of whispered hope. All around him, he meticulously drew ancient charms on the ground. Strange rune-like lines seemed to be carved into the air, securing his belief in the power of defense against evil spirits. The atmosphere immediately changed. The wind outside stopped, and there was only Gabriel's steady breathing and the soft echo of his intuition. An invisible pressure began to rise with each word of the prayer. It pressed on the person standing inside the circle, as if wrapped in a sacred net, while also compressing all the evil power to the periphery, waiting to attack. The space became more and more concentrated with each moment. Every tiny sound, the falling salt, his breath, Gabriel's low heartbeat, echoed clearly, making reality and nothingness seem to merge into one. The mixture of light, the smell of salt, the charms, the breathing, and the mystical energy around the circle created a feeling that was both sacred and uncertain, inviting the reader and the character to enter this challenging and perilous supernatural domain. This was the very moment that the real spiritual battle began, a place where all boundaries between life and death, good and evil, reason and darkness, became fragile, and all hope of survival relied solely on the sacred will of the person holding the salt circle. Just as he completed the protective salt circle, the space around Gabriel suddenly changed violently. The sky was clear at that moment, but soon thick black clouds gathered from all four directions, coiling around the scene like a mysterious bruise spreading across the skin of the sky. A spine-chilling blast of cold air appeared right at the back of everyone's neck, as if signaling that the invisible forces had accepted the challenge. From the middle of the air, raindrops suddenly poured down. They were strange and violent, completely defying the laws of nature. The wind swirled into large vortexes, sweeping away leaves, dirt, and even the ceremonial cloths. Then it roared fiercely through every street corner. Lightning and thunder tore through the sky repeatedly, The booming sounds erupted in their chests, creating an extremely pressurized electrical field. The lanterns hung around the area flickered continuously. One by one they all went out, leaving a patch of darkness that was characteristic of intentional supernatural confrontations. The smell of earth and newly sprinkled salt mingled with the scent of the cold storm, awakening the survival instincts and faith of every living entity present. Standing at the heart of the storm, Gabriel did not waver. Even though the rain and wind seemed to want to drown the entire ritual, he remained in his solemn position next to the salt circle, silently chanting the ancient incantation. His eyes blazed with absolute resolve. The motivation from his will to survive, compassion and faith, made him like a still rock, blocking the very threshold of darkness. That chaotic scene, with the wind, rain, thunder, darkness, the lights going out, and the knocking of the other world's door, created a perfect premise for the uneven battle between good and evil. This was the moment when all boundaries were erased, where every second was packed with potential danger, and where Gabriel's courage, will, and spiritual energy would be tested to the extreme by the oldest, most hostile forces. The protective circle glowed with a faint blue light. A mysterious cold mist covered Gabriel and the ritual space, making his every nerve cell feel like it was about to burst. From the middle of the darkness, a thick, gloomy smoke coiled into a shape. The ghost materialized, not in the form of a normal person, but as a blurry, vague entity. Its face was empty, with a white hazy area where its eyes, forehead and lips should have been. Laughter came from that nameless body. Sometimes it was a soft hiss, other times a choked, sighing growl, and then it was sharp like a knife cutting the air, wailing and hiding in every empty space. That laughter didn't just echo from the outside, it crashed directly into Gabriel's mind, digging deep into his darkest memories, where he had buried hauntings and failures for so many years. The scene around the circle was chaotic. The light flickered in the rain of darkness, the wind howled fiercely, and the rhythm of the incantation became disjointed. Right now Gabriel was being submerged by the ghostly resentment into a dance of bloody memories. The old days of failed exorcisms, the screams of lost loved ones, the desperate looks of so many souls he had helped, who then got lost again. Each memory became a piece of a dagger that cut and bled the body and soul of the veteran exorcist. He struggled against it, holding on only with his resilient will and a fragile belief in the light. Space and time seemed to be bent. At one moment, Gabriel was lost in the river of his youthful memories. The next, he was collapsing before an image of his future self, old, helpless, and insignificant against the power of darkness that was devouring every effort, every passion, and every human aspiration he had ever built. This section needs to alternate between the rhythm of reality, the rain, the sound of the incantation, the salt light, Gabriel's breathing, and supernatural hallucinations, the ghost screams, the sight of reincarnating blood, the disjointed film clips of his memories. The overall effect creates a prolonged battle that is not just external, but internal as well. It pushes Gabriel to the abyss of breakdown and forces him to confront the very darknesses he was most afraid of. In conclusion, the ghost's attack was not meant to kill him, but to test his faith, to make Gabriel confront all of his wounds, to connect with Eliza from the very roots of her pain, setting the stage for the rescue and forgiveness in the following sections. This is one of the key segments that determines the quality, emotion, and haunting power of the work. It needs to be dense with memory, layers of meaning, and visual and auditory impressions that go far beyond the normal exorcism ritual space. The air outside the salt circle was already heavy to the point of being suffocating, but inside, the power of the evil spirit seemed to erupt violently. With Gabriel were two priests assisting the ritual, their shadows precarious behind the swinging lantern light. Suddenly, one priest clutched his stomach and fell to his knees. His face was pale, cold sweat poured out, and then his mouth erupted with dark red blood. He tried to hold his rosary beads, but his eyes were unfocused. His broken, gasping breaths echoed between the sound of the rain and the disjointed incantation. The other colleague didn't even have time to react. His entire body trembled violently, as if an invisible force was piercing through every muscle. His eyes went blank, his arms and legs twitched on the cracked ground. Then he passed out completely, collapsing like a soulless corpse right in the middle of the sacred place. The shadows of the two men were like puppets being submerged by a supernatural wave. That sight immediately tightened around the space, turning the ritual into a battlefield of despair and pain. The sound of blood dripping onto the ground, the moans interspersed with the gloomy sound of the wind, all blended with the screams of the ghostly force rising outside the salt circle. Those sounds echoed, bouncing from the walls to the stones, from people's hearts to the windows. They wove a suffocating wall of fear and danger that no one except Gabriel had the strength to resist. The helplessness against the evil force's defiance, and the worry that even good people could be crushed under the storm of vengeance, made Gabriel see the heavy responsibility on his shoulders more clearly. Every second, every heartbeat of his had to be exchanged for ironclad faith, because he knew that if he fell, not only would he personally vanish, but darkness would also descend upon the entire world of the living. The space became more and more filled with danger and tragedy. A real battle has erupted under the sky of both the living and the dead. The air in the reflecting circle blazed with a faint blue light. The light was both weak and intense, like a fragile sign left behind in the middle of the spiritual storm. Gabriel, although physically and mentally exhausted after the continuous supernatural attacks, still stood straight. His determined eyes, interwoven with the ground, showed a fusion of faith and despair. He began to chant ancient prayers in a language that was only passed down through old books and rituals. The sound that came out was deep and warm yet fierce. Each word was like a spear that shot directly into the vortex of darkness coiling around the salt circle. Each syllable, each echoing chime, created a flickering protective field between him and the evil forces. It blended with the sound of the rain, the sudden flashes of lightning, and the bitter cold of the late night. From the hazy smoke outside the edge of the seal, Eliza's ghost appeared more clearly. Her figure was distorted and bony, with an empty stare and streaks of bloody tears running down from the corners of her eyes to her chin. That gaze was like a sharp knife, seeping into every layer of his memory, stirring up a deep, bone-piercing wave of painful emotions in Gabriel. The times he failed to save her soul, the fear of being haunted by the past, the loneliness of facing a darkness that no one could verify, his fragile will to live, and his belated regret. The growling laughter and the howling wind whistling through the window cracks created a symphony that tore through both reality and the spirit. The battle between good and evil, light and darkness, memory and the present became extremely tense. Every time Gabriel stepped back in the ritual, a layer of protection was breached. A new wave of reason was confronted by the storm of resentment. At times he almost gave up, letting the painful images wrap around him and make his body collapse. But then his will to live, and his faith in his mission pulled him back up. He was burning with the spirit of a person who had been through many storms and had not drowned in the black lake of destiny. The conflict inside and out between ancient magic and internal pressure made every breath, every sound around him a sign of life or death. Gabriel struggled, sometimes weak in his guilty memories, other times rising with the power of lightning in a closed sky, directing all of his strength into an unprecedented battle between light and dark. Toward the end, the fierce coexistence of the divine light of prayer and the lonely darkness of the ghost formed a dense supernatural painting. It compressed the emotions of the character and the reader into a climax, a place where only will, compassion and a belief in salvation had the ability to withstand all the destructive power of the past and hatred. Gabriel knew this battle wasn't about destruction, but about transformation. It wasn't about winning or losing, but about opening up a final resting place for both the restless spirit and himself. The scene became quiet after the brutal supernatural battles. In the circle of light, a mix of violet blue and pale yellow, Gabriel stood in the middle of a hazy space. Each of his breaths blended with the constant sound of rain falling outside the protective circle, creating a meditative low rhythm that soothed all the previous chaos. He focused his gaze deep into Eliza's soul. Her eyes were no longer burning with hatred, but were glistening with doubt and a yearning for redemption. With gentle words, not just an incantation but also the comfort of human kindness, Gabriel gently guided the soul back to its last memories. The desperate rainy night, the betrayal, the final moments on the shaky edge between life and death. Eliza was forced to confront the very moment she had struggled between resentment and the desire to be forgiven and remembered. Gabriel did not destroy the resentful spirit. Instead, he used the power of compassion and empathy to evoke gentle voices in the girl's soul, her father's voice, her mother's, the promises of hope from her childhood that once were. Under the soft, dim light, and the echoing ancient prayers that sounded like strings connecting one realm to another, the atmosphere of the ritual gradually became a symphony of comfort and salvation. Eliza slowly let go of her hatred. Her face faded.
but it was at peace. Her breathing returned to a peaceful rhythm. Her soul gradually separated from the physical world, shedding all the unjust shackles of the past to move toward a liberating light. Gabriel, in the end, also fell to his knees, exhausted, in the middle of the protective salt circle. But in his heart was a deep conviction. The vicious cycle had truly ended. The first cold breeze blew through the scene, but it carried a sense of tranquility, containing a newfound peace for the souls that had been forever bound between darkness and light. In the faint and hazy light remaining from the ritual circle, Eliza's soul began to move gently, like a wisp of morning mist slowly dissolving in the thin morning sun. The light from the salt circle suddenly became more shimmering. It gently enveloped her form, as if caressing and supporting her one last time before her release. Eliza gradually let go of all the hatred, resentment, and accumulated pain. All that was left was a faint light smile and calm eyes, as clear and peaceful as a lake at the beginning of autumn. The soul's body slowly blurred, dissolving into the light, and turning into a miraculous streak of light that flew high toward the arch of the sky. No darkness could hold it anymore. The rain was still falling outside, but now it was just refreshing water, no longer heavy and gloomy as before. The space calmed down, becoming strangely peaceful. Each gentle gust of wind was like a sigh after a long, painful dream. It was as if even the deepest, most hidden corners of this place were filled with a feeling of tranquility and lightness. There were no loud noises, no fierce thunder. It was just a quiet, nameless moment of serenity, like the final, complete sleep for a soul that had just been set free. The light that had been flickering and dancing on the salt circle also gradually faded, leaving behind a pure and warm feeling that spread to everyone who remained at the scene. Gabriel quietly looked up at the streak of light dissolving in the night sky. In his heart, a deep conviction and gentle hope suddenly surged. The cycle of pain had closed, and the resentful spirit had truly found its stopping point. From this moment, the ghost of Eliza would no longer stir up lonely souls, and peace could once again sow its seeds on this land that was once full of hauntings. It was a release, a caring wish, and also a small blessing for everyone, the living, the deceased, and even the wounds that had once torn their souls apart. Kenji opened his eyes in the small, quiet room. Everything around him seemed to be covered in a soft, new light after the long night of chaos. A faint ray of sunlight pierced through the glass pane of the window, blending with the last raindrops still gently falling outside, creating a shimmering, hazy effect on the pale gray wall. He heard the gentle sound of the rain very clearly. It was a familiar sound, but now it evoked a different feeling. It was clear and serene, mixed with a bitter nostalgia. Kenji's body still felt a slight numbness in his head. His joints were sore as if after a long fever. In his mind it seemed that all the memories of the ritual and the emotions that had pulled him into the abyss were now just a vague hazy patch, like a nightmare that had just faded, but whose after effects still lingered around his eyelids. He sighed, and it was a sigh of indescribable relief, mixed with a vague anxiety about the unformed future after this special night. Kenji sat up slowly, leaning his hand on the edge of the bed. He took a deep breath, letting the cool scent of dawn and the smell of damp earth after the rain fill his chest. Outside the window, the color of the sky was beginning to change from gray to the pale blue of a new day. The faint light on Kenji's face blended with the fragile look of a person who had just experienced pain and been resurrected. The moment of waking up wasn't really an ending, but a sign of a new beginning, a new day, a new opportunity. The journey ahead was still full of challenges, but he felt more at peace and hopeful than ever before. He felt that he had grown another layer, becoming more profound and weathered, ready to accept all of destiny's tests, with a sense of gratitude for being alive, for having changed, and for being given the chance to start over with a soul that was no longer suffocated by the darkness.
Gabriel sat quietly beside Kenji, while the night sky above was slowly transforming from its gloomy dark color to the soft pure hues of a new dawn. After all the challenges, struggles, and even the old wounds that had erupted violently, he could clearly feel that each breath was lighter, and every bit of fatigue in his body was slowly fading away. A gentle peace seeped into his mind. The vicious cycle, after years of torment and a series of days spent constantly reliving the past, had finally come to a close. The darkness of the resentments, the belated bitterness, and the unspoken losses, all of it subsided with the last light of the ritual, giving way to faith and tranquility. Gabriel sighed with relief. His eyes were profound and somber, but full of hope. He knew he still had roads to travel,
debts to cleanse, and many souls to touch. But today, from this very moment, all the burdens had been lifted. His journey of atonement had taken a long step forward. The space around him also changed. The plants were still. The early pink light shone through the leaves. A young breeze gently caressed the dry branches. The natural sounds, the rustling of dry leaves, the soft caress of the wind, and the tiny stars at the end of the sky, formed the most serene and authentic harmony of peace's return. In that rare moment, sitting on the edge of the final salt circle, Gabriel realized that the ending was not the end. It was the beginning of a new phase. A phase of healing, of reconciling with himself and with the forces that had once dragged him into the abyss. Tonight the darkness had chosen to let go, and those who remained would have the chance to step forward toward true peace.
Some pains do not need an explanation. They just need to be seen by others, called by their true name, and then released. That is what Gabriel, the Death Walker, did. Not to be a hero, but just to atone for a piece of humanity in the forgotten souls. If you felt something from this story, please leave a comment and share your thoughts below. You can also hit like, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next episodes in Gabriel's journey. The Whisper Horror channel will be back every week with new chapters, new souls, and debts that have never been paid. Because sometimes, ghosts don't come from hell. They come from the memories we tried to forget.